Thank you all for coming. It's good to see such a nice big crowd here today. It's also great for us to be celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Tata-Cornell Institute. And we have a series of events that are going on through the year. And those of you who would like to be alerted to them, please make sure you give your email address to Jessica. She'll make sure you are on our mailing list as we go forward. Those of you who've not been to our exhibition, please do so. We'll be, I think it closes up end of the month?
It's extended till mid-October.
Oh, it's till mid-October, so you still have a bit of time, but you should rush and see it while it's still fresh. Okay, it's a great exhibition, and again, Jessica did a lot of work putting that together. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Panagariya, who's come from New York to give the Tata-Cornell Distinguished Lecture as part of the 5th anniversary celebrations. Professor Panagariya is someone that doesn't need an introduction. He's very, very well known in the academic circles in the US and also in the policy making and political circles in India. Professor Panagariya is currently a professor of economics and holds the Jagdish Bhagwati chair at Columbia University. Most recently, he was in India trying to put his theory to practice as the vice chair of the NITI Aayog, the old planning commission of India. And he has learned a lot from that experience. I'm sure that he'll tell us a lot about some of his experiences in that position. He was also the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank, and before that, professor at University of Maryland. Professor Panagariya has a PhD from Princeton, and he's written several books, highly acclaimed books, and journal articles in some of the best journals in our field, American Economic Review and other top journals. And he also has an op-ed that he writes regularly for in Indian newspapers, the Times of India, I think, and also the Economic Times. So he's well-read. His thoughts are very well-read in the Indian policy community, and he's been making a huge difference in bringing about strong economic thinking to the political process in India. So, Professor Panagariya, with that, I'd like to invite you to come and give your distinguished lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bengali. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I think I'm returning after almost 12 or 13 years. So great pleasure. A lot of things have happened in my life and the world's life in the 13 years. I did actually go in the morning to see the exhibit, and I strongly recommend. It's a very, very interesting. Covers a lot of the work that the institute is doing, but in a very interesting sort of way. So do try and visit the exhibit. Today's lecture, I thought, Professor Bengali said I speak for about 40 minutes or so. So what I would do is, lay down a very wide kind of canvas before you. And a lot of the interesting things probably will come in your question and answer sessions. So, be prepared with all your questions after I finish the formal presentation. So, and unless, if you really have some burning question of clarification as I speak, then certainly raise your hand and I'll clarify. But I feel that for the kind of lecture I'm going to deliver, it will be perhaps a bit more efficient if I finish my lecture and then we get to the Q&A. But I also do not want you to sort of, stay completely quiet if there is some issue of clarification that would help not just you, but everybody else as well. It is not going to be a particularly complicated kind of lecture. It's not, in this sense, not a technical lecture. Nevertheless, there may still be things that may require clarification. What I want to first say, a few words about the second part, actually, of the lecture, where to. But then I'm going to speak quite a bit about where from. Today, the Indian economy is about $2.6 trillion. It is the sixth largest economy, having just bypassed France, I think. And it's a matter of, maybe 10 years or less that it will become third largest. So, the economies that remain ahead for India to cross are UK, where it's very close anyway. It will happen in, if not this year, next year. Then you got Germany, which is a bit farther ahead, and Japan, which is also a further bit ahead. But all this will take less than 10 years. Today, India is actually growing at about 7.5%. I think this is going to cross, it is going to cross about 8%. But actually, if you do the calculation in real dollars, very likely the growth rate will be closer to 9%. I say this against the background that if I take the last 15 years, starting from, India's fiscal year starts from April 1 and ends on March 31. So you'll see when and all the data in India are collected by fiscal year. So I'll often say 2003-4. I'm referring to the fiscal year. I'm not referring to 2 calendar years. They are just the fiscal year. So 2003-4 to 17-18. That's a 15-year period. India's GDP growth rate during this period in real rupees, domestic currency, was 7.6%. If I do the same calculation in real dollars, it's a little more than 9.5%. It's a hell of a rate of growth. I mean, and now that the base of the economy is much larger, it's 2.6 trillion. Now what we will see when growing at those growth rates of 8 or 9%, there's going to be a major transformation. So it's a transformation for India, of course, and those of us who have watched the last 15 years and also have the knowledge of what happened prior to that, really appreciate the kind of transformation that has happened for most of you sitting here, the millennials or near millennials, meaning having born maybe in the 1990s or late 1980s. You would probably not realize what kind of transformation has happened, particularly when you compare it against what India used to be. But those of us who have seen actually that India realize how rapid, how impressive this transformation has been in the last 15 years. But what we, meaning those of us are those in their 50s and 60s, can see about the last 15 years, you all will see about the next 15. Because that transformation, because of the very large base of the GDP, is going to be much bigger. It's going to be much bigger. Indeed, this is also going to have much bigger implications for the global economy and global politics, for that matter, because when India becomes the third largest economy, with China and the United States are as the two other largest economies, the whole geopolitical scenarios are going to be quite different. This is all beginning to evolve. There is no question, it is beginning to happen. Even the kind of very warm relationship that has developed between the United States and India in the last several years, it's not just very recent, but it started off in some about after India did those nuclear tests in 1999 or 98. And since then, it really has warmed up dramatically. And it's not just warmed up, but it is substantively a very different relationship today. And this is very likely it's going to continue in that direction. I think that, geopolitics is not my area, but certainly I can see what changes have been happening. So I think, going forward, unless India does something terribly stupid, which is possible, in a democracy, stupid things can happen. But unless that happens, or unless something, globally catastrophic happens, we would see actually the kind of development that I'm referring to. The reason I think I'm so confident why this would happen is that, a lot of the economic reforms that India needed have happened. A lot more still need to happen. But even as we stand today, it is on the back of the reforms that the economy has grown. When I said last 15 years, 7.6% in real rupees and 9.5% in real dollars. That has happened on the back of the reforms. Those reforms are in place. India today is a far more open economy. It is internally far more competitive. It could be more competitive. Nevertheless, it is a very competitive economy. Savings rate is relatively high, about 30% or so. It has fallen a bit in the last 4 or 5 years, or last about 6, 7 years. But still it is 30%. And the very fact that it used to be, at peak, it had come to about 35%, tells me that it could rise back to that level. And still, per capita incomes in India are low. They are about $2,000 per capita per year, compared to something like $55,000 in the United States. What that tells you is that the productivity level, average productivity level per worker is still extremely low in India, which means that, if the productivity frontier is up here, this is where the United States productivity level is, India is down here. And as it races towards that, it can really grow very rapidly. So savings, high savings rate means that the room for capital accumulation, that the capital accumulation that is required for rapid growth is happening, will happen. Productivity growth is another thing which has to happen. And labor input, that's the other major input. Also for that, demographically, India is very well positioned. It still needs to kind of, do proper education and skilling and so forth. That's a process underway. But remember that the current, the last 15 years growth of 7.6% has been done pretty much, with this general demography and so forth, and it can only get better as we go forward. So that is my kind of, answer to or my kind of take on the second half of the title of the talk, where to. This is where I expect, this is where I think we will see India heading. Now, I want to go back actually, what happened, because as I just said, is a relatively recent phenomenon, actually, and it is a very dramatically different phenomenon than what those of us who grew in India in 1960s and 70s observed, and that is where I want to return for a moment. So these are very summary kind of rates of growth for you. As I said, I want to take a broad brush. One can divide some of this more finely, but for our purpose right now, this should be good enough. That almost, so India became independent from the British in 1947, and so this is 87 up to 87, 88. So 1951, 88, when I say it's 51, 52 to 87, 88. Okay? So you got almost 40 years of this period when the economy grew extremely slowly, only 3.8%. There is no question we did grow, so India did not do as badly as many of the African countries, where there were long periods of negative growth or no growth whatsoever. That India really never experienced. So a lot of the policy measures that were taken in the national interest did pay off to some degree. Now, sometime, but nevertheless, we got the policy framework quite wrong. The policy framework that dominated for those decades all the way up to 1991 was largely wrong. Sometimes, we have the commentators who would say that, well, look, if you look back under the British, first half of the 20th century, growth was negligible, almost none. Perhaps per capita income may have declined during that 50-year period, even though we had, free trade and laissez-faire and so forth. And so therefore, the command and control model that India adopted actually paid off. I personally don't buy that line of argument for the simple reason that, when a colonial power was ruling, almost all policies were designed to benefit the colonial power, not the country. And any policy shift that was finally in the interest of the nation, in the interest of the people, would have produced some positive change, which is what we did. Real question is really whether we produced what was possible. And I'd argue we did not, actually, because countries that had very different policies during these years also, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and here I'm referring to South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, did far better. They grew 8 to 10% a year starting from early 1960s. And even though in 1950 these countries and India and China had started at the same level, they are now at very, very different levels of per capita incomes. Even China, which did very poorly, like India in the first 3 decades, such that in 1980, if you look at the World Bank data, you will find Indian per capita income was about 10% higher than the Chinese per capita income. But once China started opening up, and it was not a half-hearted thing, it really kind of then opened up and adopted growth-friendly policies, and things dramatically changed. Today, China is way richer in per capita income terms, and of course, because it's also very large, it's in GDP terms significantly larger than India. So I think it didn't quite deliver what was potentially deliverable, but certainly a policy framework that was geared to the national interest did do something good for the country, but really very little, very little. You'll see, I think this is my kind of, this chart tells you pretty much the full story. There's one chart. I mean, basically it's related to the growth rates that you saw before, but this is a little bit a different kind of view of the same thing. In effect, what you'll see is the following. If you start in 1950, and I normalize the income, let's say, that in 1950, in real terms, so this is all done with the data which are at 2004-5 prices. These are the data at 2004-5 prices. So these are all real, meaning, inflation has been taken out of the data series. So this is in real terms. So roughly, if you think about, I mean, it's really indexed. It is indexed that if whatever units you're measuring in, if it is 100 in 1950, then how it evolves. But for practical purposes, you can think of, per capita income being maybe 100 rupees per week in 1950, and then look at the evolution. You come to 1980-81, it rises from 100 to 151. So 30 years, 30 long years, all we have added during those 30 years to per capita income is about 50 rupees, just 50% addition. And that, of course, is connected to the rate of growth I showed you, 3.8% GDP, and per capita was 1.6% or some ridiculously low number. You take the next decade, and you go to 206 for discussion purposes. I'll just say 200. So whatever we added in the first 30 years got added in just 10. So it accelerated. 1980s is what I call our transition decade. This is a period during which the policies began to shift a bit. I'm going to talk about the policies in a minute. That's where I'm going to return. But first setting the stage. So you come to 1991, you get to 206. Then you get to 2000, 2001. 295 for rounding. I'll round it up to 300. So now you got 10-year period during which you have added 100, which is as much as was added in the preceding 40 years. And it is twice of what was added in the preceding decade. In the preceding decade, you had added 50. Now you have added 100. And then you look at what happened post 2000, 2001, and you go to about 600. You have added 300 rupees per week to the income, which is 1.5 times of what you had added in the entire 50 years. So you can see that those of us who grew in the 50s, 60s, and 70s really didn't see much of a change. And I can distinctly remember 1974, I came to the US, and if I think of the preceding 10 years, there had been no change in our lives, no change in our lives. And that was particularly bad decade, actually, from the growth perspective. So now, why am I talking about growth? You're going to think, right? I mean, and this is a big debate in India, always controversial, that, oh, you all want growth for growth's sake. But that was never the objective in India. If you look back, those of us who have read history know that the country had sought growth never for its own sake. The objective was always removal of abject poverty of the country. So even if you can go back, read Jawaharlal Nehru's discovery of India, he'll tell you there that in 1938 when they started this planning committee, a planning committee was appointed. So by this time they were expecting that India will become free, it will become independent. So it was time to start thinking, what are we going to do? How are we going to plan once we become independent? And so Nehru tells you this story there, and they really collected in this planning committee on economic policy the guiding lights of the, meaning, that they, from various professions, from engineering, science, economics background, the top people from that period, Nehru being the chairman of that committee. And he recalls saying that, look, to have any discussion, we couldn't do it in vacuum. We had to have some sort of clear objective. And that objective was the removal of abject poverty of India. But then he said, we discussed, that how could we do it, and we quickly realized that the income levels were so low, they were so abject, so incredibly low that redistribution simply won't go very far. In fact, if you equally redistributed the entire income, everybody will fall under any kind of plausible poverty line. So therefore, we decided that we had to grow very rapidly. Without growth, we couldn't get there. And we felt that what we needed to end poverty in 10 years' time was about 600% growth. But he said that seemed too exceptional, too high. We didn't think we could do that. So we set a goal of 300% growth. So the reason I tell you the story is that ultimately it was the removal of abject poverty, which was always the objective. And you can read through the subsequent 5-year plans and so forth. This is all the poverty, removal of poverty kind of runs through as the central theme of these 5-year plans. So now, ultimately the failure really happened at the level of growth itself. Growth did not happen. Now, growth did not happen. That, of course, also meant that the poverty did not quite decline. So India does have a good tradition of doing the expenditure surveys, and we started almost in 1951 or so, the first expenditure survey. So annually you can find these expenditure surveys, and you can calculate, draw some poverty line, and based on that poverty line, you can do the poverty numbers, which a lot of the researchers have done. So I've just taken these numbers from a study. But what you would see effectively is that good weather poverty goes down, bad weather poverty goes up. But if you look at the trend, hardly any trend to the extent that a trend can be seen. Maybe it's a slightly kind of upward rising trend rather than declining trend. But there's no statistical significance to that line. So effectively, if you look at poverty levels in mid-1970s, they're no different than what you had in 1950s. And it's really largely because the growth really did not happen. See where we'll go next. Now, look at the periods that the growth then began to happen. Here what I've done is because the poverty line itself shifts around for different periods. I don't have the full series from 80s onwards. But what I've done here is, so this is the post-1990s period. Now, 1991 is a watershed year for India. That's the time when the thinking changed in a systematic way. I said 1980s was a transition decade, so that was the period during which changes were happening in the policy. Some liberalization was happening on a very ad hoc sort of basis. But 91 was a sort of change of mindset, systematic reforms began at the time. And so this period really effectively sort of therefore covers the post-reform period. And what I've done here is this very large expenditure survey India does, roughly at every 5 years. But 99-2000 is not very comparable, so I've dropped that. So what you have here is 93-94, 2004-05, and 2011-12. Now you remember that the growth, the very rapid growth India has had, if you look at this here, was the 2003 to 2012. That's a 9-year period when India grew 8.3%. And then you got the prior period, which is about close to 6%. But the really rapid growth is between 2003 to 12. And sort of, roughly solid growth prior to that, 1990s. And look at what happens to the poverty figures. 93-94 down to 2004-05. But then you take very sharp decline, actually. Now, remember also that not only in percentage point terms, decline is a lot larger in the second period, but it is also a shrunken period. It's only 7 years, versus that period, 93-94 to 4-5, is 11 years. So poverty fell during both the periods, and this is a period, both periods are periods of high growth, except that the second period is much faster growth. And you do see a very, very significant drop in poverty. Now, when I started doing these numbers and I began talking, then you always, in India, there's always this resistance, so that somehow in aggregate we have done fine, but somehow the disadvantaged groups really haven't benefited from such growth. That if you look at the scheduled tribes and scheduled castes, which are India's kind of historically disadvantaged groups, they have not done well. So luckily it turns out that these surveys also collect information on the castes of the households, and so they have covered scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and there is also OBCs, the other backward castes, which I'll not show you here, but those numbers are also there in the paper that I have written. Separately, you can look at those, and then you can take everybody together and just see where the numbers look. So this is scheduled tribes on the left, scheduled castes in the middle, and the entire population. What you'll observe, of course, the levels of poverty are the highest among the scheduled tribes, which are not in the mainstream of the economy. Scheduled tribes also are predominantly rural in character. So that removes them already, from the urban mainstream where the growth is happening. In addition, tribes even in rural areas often tend to be a bit isolated. Scheduled castes, on the contrary, kind of are a little bit better integrated with the mainstream of even the rural economy. So you nevertheless see, particularly in the fast growth phase, poverty declining significantly among scheduled tribes. Largest decline is among scheduled castes, and indeed, if you look at the general population and scheduled castes, you see the convergence happening. The gaps are much larger if you look at the prior years, 93-94 particularly. So it's not that growth has really, at least the data don't support that at all, actually. So I was pleasantly surprised doing the data that, and then the surveys also allow you to do this by religion. So they find that they also have data on who is Hindu, who is Muslim, who is Jain, who is Sikh, who is Buddhist, and you can do this data across all those religions as well. I haven't put the slide in here, but you see the same pattern. And generally, these poverty rates differ, but the reduction happens uniformly across all castes. So clear, so in effect, now, we can talk about, whether this was growth or the social programs and so forth. We can come back, return to that. Here, in fact, this is the religion-wise: Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Jainism, Sikhism, and you can see, significant declines in poverty across all religions. It's not as though anybody is being left behind. Again, larger poverty rates are higher among the Muslims than among the Hindus, but convergence is seen. And you can disaggregate further. I have one more slide here, which does it by the states. Hardly any state there where poverty did not decline between 93, 94 and 11, 12. So every single state, these are all 18 or 21 largest states of India, and not all 29 are here, but the largest ones I've represented here on the graph, and you see poverty declining across everybody. So there's no question that this growth has actually helped. Now, let me leave that here. Very quickly now, the issue really comes in, what went wrong, right? What went wrong? Yes, Ishwar. This is a Tendulkar line. So throughout, this is a Tendulkar poverty line, which is the official poverty line in India. Yes, that's a good question. Yeah, so there is issues about whether the poverty line is too low, but I have done these numbers, doing 1.5 times Tendulkar line to twice of Tendulkar line, and even 1.25, and the pattern remains unchanged. As you get to that very high poverty line, like twice of what the Tendulkar line is, then the magnitudes decline, and that's not surprising. That's not surprising because the mass of the population is at the lower level of poverty, lower poverty line. So you get, in absolute terms, you get larger declines. But the pattern is, qualitatively, the pattern is unchanged. So it really has happened across the board. It's not, and that also is reflected back if you do the Gini coefficients, So it sort of fluctuates, and if you look at it between 1994 and today, maybe 11, 12, there's some movement, perhaps a little higher Gini coefficient, but it's not significantly high. I mean, it's not jumping by like, some 10 percentage points or 12 percentage points. It's not like that. But if there is an increase, a very small increase. So that sort of at least roughly says that benefits did go to pretty much all levels. But certainly benefits did go to the bottom levels, there's no question about that. And Tendulkar poverty line is relatively low poverty line, and there you see very large impacts. All right, so the story is very long, so for which we really don't have the time. But in effect, the policy regime that India chose was the wrong one. First presumption was that this was a political presumption, which I can understand sort of in the early years, but should have been modified in later years. The presumption was that, look, we can just become politically free, and we will not be truly independent unless we economically were also independent in the sense of being self-sufficient, in the sense that you do not have to depend on foreigners to buy what you consume or to sell what you produce. So there's sort of Nehruvian view that, look, if we can't really be dependent like that on the foreign markets, and if you remain dependent on the foreign markets, then it's really not true independence. And so the first thing was we got to start producing everything. Diversification became the rallying cry, and we shouldn't depend on trade. But that's a fatal thing for a country, you see, because from the economic standpoint, because you see the implications. If you need bicycles domestically, you have to not only assemble bicycles, but then you have to produce the parts of the bicycles. You have to produce steel that goes into bicycles. You have to produce the machines which produce the parts of the bicycle, the whole bit. And when you are so dirt poor, you can't have producing everything. But that's what we tried to do. And that, of course, meant that the public sector came as a player in a big way. It was because of that, but also, of course, because of the very clearly stated objective that we wanted a socialistic pattern of society. Right? So at least Nehru was milder in this respect. So Nehru sort of said that, well, there are a lot of calls that to be truly socialist, the government should own the means of production. This is the Russian model. the Russian model, Soviet model. And therefore, the government should nationalize all the large industries, and particularly the ones that were owned by the foreigners. But to his credit, Nehru stood his ground. He said that, no, we will not nationalize anything. But what we would do is progressively more and more activity will be channeled through the public sector. So the savings will be mobilized by this government through taxation and all, and then it will invest in the industries. And all the heavy industries, it said, will reserve for the public sector, so steel, aluminum, anything, machinery. The state went into it in a very heavy way. There's one part of the approach to this. Also felt that, well, we don't want to rule out private sector, it's a mixed economy. So the philosophy was not that we'll go all the way to the Soviet Union, but we'll have a mixed economy, so private sector will have a role to play. But then private sector may not invest according to the priorities of the nation. National priorities may be very different from what the market might tell them, and therefore we need licensing. So any bigger investment you want to do, and at that time the threshold was very low, something like maybe 10 million rupees or 50 million rupees, some very low threshold, that any investment that's larger than that threshold has to be done through license. You cannot do it without procuring a license from the Ministry of Industry. And of course, then the government set the priorities that like clothing industry, textile industry, that's not a priority, so don't even apply for a license, you're not going to get it. But if you want to produce chemicals, if you want to produce tires, if you want to produce some of the heavy stuff, you'll get the license. And so anybody who had any means of investment effectively started going into these very large, these heavy industry kind of. And of course, the state went into these industries in a big way as well. Now there was an issue of employment. What are we going to do? Where are the jobs going to be? So the thinking was that, well, jobs we need to create in industries where you don't require too much investment. Because if you get these heavy industries are not going to create jobs, so the jobs have to be created in these light manufacturing industries. But obviously we are channeling all the investable resources into these heavy industry. So cottage industry will do all the light industry. Light manufacturers will be done by cottage industry, which eventually morphed into what we came to call the small scale industries. But that's where clothing will be produced, that's where footwear will be produced, that's where daily needs, things like kitchenware, umbrellas, whatever else that you need, what you qualify as light manufacturer, that will be done in the cottage or small scale industry sector. And this got formalized under Mrs. Indira Gandhi in 1969, that got formalized into a clear list which explicitly kind of listed, which eventually grew to about 800 different items, called the small scale industries reservation, that only small enterprises will be allowed to produce these products, where small was like, something like $1 million worth of investment, nothing more. The threshold was very low. So what that meant was, if you're producing clothing, your company can be only $1 million or less in investment. Obviously, you're immediately excluded from the world markets. You can't do the quality. Plus, of course, the autarkic trade policies anyway shut the door to trade. So if you couldn't import the high quality fabric, you could not manufacture the high quality clothing. So you couldn't compete in the global marketplace. Your exports were low. If exports were low, revenues, foreign exchange was low. Foreign exchange was low, you needed to control the imports. So this is a vicious circle that you had import control, so you couldn't export. You couldn't export. There was not enough foreign exchange, so therefore you needed import controls, and this spiraled in. And their trade, I'm yet to see a country where international trade actually, as a proportion of the GDP, declines while the economy is growing, however modestly. I mean, India in this, even during this period, was growing at least at modest rate of between 3 and 4%. But if you look at the exports to GDP and import to GDP ratio, that's declining. You see here, and I want to particularly show you the next one where the imports, what happened to the imports, 1969-70, at least at peak in 1950s, we were about at least 10%. Imports as a proportion of the GDP had at peak reached close to 10%. 69-70, it drops to 4%. I mean, that's autarky, that's nearly no trade whatsoever. And then this process really, of course, ultimately fed into the poor rate of growth until the second half of the 1970s. People began to sort of see that this was really not working, and there was some push by the industry that, you know, we can't find our inputs, we can't get machinery, something needs to give way, you need to liberalize, and also some process of ad hoc liberalization started in the second half of the 1970s, very ad hoc, which sort of picked up a little bit of speed in the 1980s. What they did was, and partly it was also, so there's a bit of a push from the business community, but also this was the time of oil crisis when some Indian workers got to go to the Middle East, started sending remittances. So that boosted a little bit of the foreign exchange. And alongside, there was also green revolution happening. This was a process, the agriculture was put on the forefront by a prime minister who had served only 1.5 years, Lal Bahadur Shastri. I mean, he believed in agriculture, so he gave the slogan Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, meaning, you know, victory to the soldier, victory to the farmer. And so he tried to push away from the Nehruvian model a bit, except that he didn't live long enough. But even during that period, you know, the seeds of green revolution were sown then. A lot of the agricultural institutional infrastructure we have today, the Food Corporation of India, the public distribution system, the Agricultural Price Commission, the National Dairy Board, all these were created during that period. But from the trade point of view, because green revolution began to happen, some of these imports, food imports, which took up a good bit of the foreign exchange, also declined. So that also released the foreign exchange. And that sort of allowed a little bit of liberalization to happen. 1980s, and what they did was, you know, anything that was not domestically produced at all, they felt, well, there was no threat to any domestic industry from imports in those sectors. So they created a list called the Open General Licensing. And they said, for these things, you don't need an import license. Okay. Now, by so just to give a quick background, by early to mid 1960s, all consumer goods imports had been fully outlawed, meaning that, you know, there's a complete ban. Only raw material and machinery could be imported, and for that you needed an import license, and you needed to show that this import is absolutely essential for your business, and you had to be the actual user of it. It's not that you could import something to sell it back on the market. That was not allowed either. So it's very, you know, the import restrictions were multi-layered and very restrictive. But open general licensing basically said, well, okay, for these products, no license is required, although you still had to show that you were the actual user, and so that was still, that condition was still imposed. But that already began to help a little bit. Now, couple of other things that happened in the second half of the 1980s was also the exchange rate was finally, you know, finally there was a sensible governor at the RBI, and he saw that the exchange rate had been greatly overvalued, and he let the exchange rate depreciate. So substantial depreciation, although still it was highly overvalued exchange rate, but still quite a bit of depreciation happened. That and a lot of East Asian style export incentives were introduced during the second half of the 1980s. So exports did a little better. But this was also a decade during which the government was inflating the economy, meaning fiscal deficits. They were, you know, hitting the roof, more than 10% when you combined state and central fiscal deficits. And that was, and the government was borrowing in the external markets. So the dollar-denominated debt was rising. So your debt service ratios were rapidly rising. So by 1990, almost 30% of the export earnings were being used to service the debt. And of course, very soon the foreign exchange reserves began to dry. 1991, there was a crisis. India basically lost all credibility in the markets, and its letters of, what are these called? Letters of credit, the LCs got refused. And that opened, and this is also politically kind of coincided with an election, which, because Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated during the election campaign, brought Narasimha Rao, the only prime minister from the Congress party who is not from the, you know, Gandhi dynasty, and with a fair bit of independence. Well, you know, Manmohan Singh is also not, but I think the rule during that period, the 2004 to 14, is very dominated by Sonia Gandhi. Yes, please.
See rupees, this recent depreciation.
Yeah, you're jumping. you're jumping. Hold it, ma'am, hold it, because we can come to that, you're jumping. Yeah. Clarification question.
Clarification. So in 1969-70, did we have a very different energy mix? Because after that, most of the imports are oil.
You can take out oil, this will become even lower. The ratio will become even lower if you want to take out oil. So this is inclusive of oil. So we are importing very little. When you do non-oil, if you do non-oil, non-food, the ratio will drop yet further. So, okay. Where was I? 91. So Prime Minister Narasimha Rao came along, and lo and behold, actually, he turned out to be very courageous. Nobody predicted, actually, because all his previous history said that he was a very indecisive leader. Turned out to be incredibly decisive. Appointed Manmohan Singh as the Prime Minister, as the Finance Minister, and started opening up the economy. Now, I'll not recount all the reforms that happened, but very large amount of liberalization. Import licensing got taken out. Investment licensing got taken out, foreign investment got opened up, and then in airline sector, private sector was given entry, telecommunication private sector was given entry, financial sector, finally the banks private banks were given much more liberal entry. A lot of financial repression that was happening was reduced, not eliminated, but reduced. A couple of years after Rao lost election in 1996, a couple of years of instability, political instability. Then Atal Bihari Vajpayee became Prime Minister. He ruled for 6 years, and he then took the threads where the Rao government had left, and again very systematically went about. The sectors that remained untouched under Vajpayee were things like higher education. Nothing happened. Railways, nothing happened. But otherwise, you name any sector, something happened in each of those sectors. And telecommunications revolution, of course, was finally brought to its logical conclusion by the Vajpayee government, which, 1999, tele density in India was about 3 telephones per 100 people. And by 2011-12, you had some 80 or 90 telephones per 100 population. So today, and now we are of course, India is in the second revolution there with the Jio coming in, which has given access to roughly everybody who can afford a smartphone, access to broadband, because it's about 10 cents per GB. So the broadband in India is a lot less expensive, order of magnitude less expensive today than in the United States or probably any other country. It's quite phenomenal. Anyway. And that's the sort of, when 2003-4 to 11-12, the kind of growth we saw. My own assessment is that this was actually driven by the reforms that Narasimha Rao did, reforms that Atal Bihari Vajpayee did. In India, have a lot of debate about, UPA versus the current government, who did better and so forth. No doubt that very high growth happened under the UPA. There is no question about it. So I was once in a debate with a very senior member of the UPA government, and I said, name me 5 reforms that you think you guys did which led to this kind of growth. And he couldn't answer, because there is no answer in the end. In the end, Vajpayee lost the election in 2004. 10 years we had the return of the Congress-led United Progressive Alliance government. And the first 5 years was okay, because nothing, reversal, one or two things you can complain about, but no real reversal happened in the reforms. And what they did was to, use the growth revenues that became available due to higher growth to build up the social safety nets. So there was welcome change, and maybe it happened more speedily than would have perhaps happened under Vajpayee. We don't know, but certainly, So but the second half of the UPA government, this UPA 2, I think a lot of bad policies were adopted, and that of course led to, you saw the growth rates in the last 2 years of the UPA rule. Finally, see, these effects always happen with lag. But as you can see, the growth rate dropped to 4.6%. This is based on the old series of the GDP figures. Now, if you do the new series, it's 5.9, that 12 to 14, 12, 13, 13, 14 average. If you take the new series, then it's about 5.9 rather than 4.6. But still, it's much lower than the 7.5% that is running today in the last 4 years. So in the end, and this is the reversal that I worry about, that if a government comes in and basically starts undoing what the previous government have done, rather than carry forward the process of reform. So a lot of the things that Vajpayee and Narasimha Rao tried to undo were the policies that particularly Mrs. Indira Gandhi had put in place. She ruled the country from 1966 to 1984 with a 3-year break in between from 1977 to 80. But it is during her rule, particularly till 1980, 1980 to 84, she was a lot different prime minister. She was not so command and control as in the earlier years. But that is the period during which so many of these restrictions got put in place in the labor markets, in the land markets, in the product markets. That's what subsequent reforms have had to undo. Still, that undoing process is not over, but it has happened. It has advanced sufficiently that I think growth with some sort of stability, macro stability, meaning keep inflation under control, fiscal deficits under control, the current account under control, meaning largely partly the job of the RBI, partly the job of the central government in holding the fiscal deficits low. If you would even do that with the current set of policies, I think the growth rate of 7.5 to 8% will be sustained. And so therefore, I think I do see that future is bright. Okay, so let me conclude here, because a lot of the questions I'm sure you would have, a lot of the things I have not said much about can come up in the Q&A. Thank you.
Are you going to walk around with this? Then
Yes.
I will go stand. All right. Thank you, Professor Panagariya, for this really panoramic view of what happened over the last 5-6 decades in India. It's a great story. It's good that it's all put together in 40 minutes. So that's a great resource for students in the future. Let's open up now and get some discussion.
So make sure to speak into the microphone so everyone can hear.
Vanisha gets the first question.
Thank you, Professor, for such an engaging lecture. So as you mentioned, the government currently is facing a lot of issues at the same time. There's scope for improvement in productivity, education, health, the development of smart cities. Do you think the government can afford to or needs to prioritize, because a lot of the issues overlap, so can it afford to prioritize certain issues over the others? And if yes, then which ones?
Can they privatize?
Prioritize.
Oh, prioritize. I don't think governments always, some priorities of course have to be there. And evidently, that shows up in all the political talk that you hear. So poor are a priority. So to the extent that you can push the social programs, and there are a lot of aspects of the social programs, I think that will remain a priority. But generally, the governments have to make progress along many different dimensions. It's in the nature of politics, because you got, and unfortunately India has too much of this, that you got 50 plus ministries. It's not going to happen that some ministries will get the funds to do things and others will not get because of the priorities. Some more, some less maybe, but some progress will have to happen on all fronts. So, but then there are some core priorities which every government sets and tries to go after.
All right. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. Good afternoon. My name is Sharan, and I'm doing a PhD at the Dyson School over here. My question is more slightly related to the where to front. So, the where to, the second part of your lecture that you spoke about with regards to where India can head. So the question was that today we are seeing that there are a lot of mega regional trade alliances that are coming in with regards to China, with regards to the fact that EU and Japan just signed an FTA that covers a third of the world's economy, with TTIP and TPP. So where do you see India posturing itself on the international trade front? Because India today, if we look at the foreign trade policy, there's just one vision document that came out in 2015, and if we look at the data that's available from 2017-18, India has not really managed to do a lot with regards to the document. So where does India head with regards to international trade? How does it posture itself in this, in terms of how the nations are allying with each other?
Yeah.
So that's my question.
Very good question. I think this is probably the weakest part of or weakest spot in the Indian economy and policy making, both. We did very well 91 to 2007 when we went with, we eliminated all import licensing, brought tariffs down from, 355% was the top tariff rate in 91, down to 10% with some exceptions. So we did that, but lately we have gone in the reverse direction. And while I generally support the present government, I did write multiple pieces actually arguing that this reversal and raising of the tariffs was a very wrong thing to do. But not only that, now you see, you mentioned all the mega regional trade arrangements. If you're following, the Trump trade war, in effect, is damaging very badly the multilateral institution. Today, United States, China, European Union, 3 largest trading entities are all in violation of the WTO rules. Very clear, flagrant violation of the WTO rules, which really, which really undermines the whole multilateral system. One has to entertain the possibility that maybe regional trade agreements will be the main game left in town. India needs to do that, So there is one mega one that is being negotiated, RCEP, Regional Economic Cooperation, or whatever, RCEPs, or Regional Cooperation for whatever, economic partnership, Regional Cooperation for Economic Partnership, which includes China. It includes all the ASEAN countries, it includes China. I think we have to, in earnest, actually become a part. We are in negotiation, but not quite sure. We are going to. I hope it comes to a conclusion, and that we are a part of it. That's very essential. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that, Professor? Because today in class we were talking about the implications to WTO with the US and others starting to move away from international trade. What do you think will happen long term to trade flows from developing countries?
Well, there's some danger, but at least for India, I don't see that it has to be defensive on that front. Our share in the global trade is about 1.6% now. We had reached 1.7 from 0.7 or something. 91, if you go 0.6, 0.7% is all we had. We went up to 1.7. Now we are down to 1.6. China is about 12, 13%. This is merchandise trade, and then there is services. Services we do a little bit better in terms of the global share. But really the big trade is merchandise trade, because it's about total trade is 15 trillion. Services is only 4 or 5 trillion. So that is where you need to make a bigger dent. I personally think that it's our internal problem. We really have, and this is something, as a general comment in India, I think what we have not successfully been able to do is scaling up. And this applies in all sorts of areas. But scaling up, and China is incredible at scaling things up. We are not. And unless you scale up, you see, think of Maruti. This is one automobile company. Every year, 3-4%, 4-5% expansion of the company. And that really lowers the cost of production. So they are able to pay better wages to their workers, but they are also able to increase their share in the market. The scale really is a huge thing. But in most other industries, we are not able to scale up. And so I see our low share not so much as a result, to be the result of what is happening in the global economy. It's our own policies which still need to be, kinds of permissions that are required. This thing called trade facilitation. An exporter, on average requires 30 or 40 clearances before the product can be exported. I think that's far too many. turnaround time on our ports, it'll take 2 to 3 days. You go to Hong Kong, Singapore, 6, 7 hours, the ships turn around. So a lot of that kind of work still needs to be done. And India has to raise its share in the global market. So even if, you see, when the market is about $20 trillion between goods and services, your problem is not whether that 20 trillion will go back to 18 or something. Even if it goes to 18, but raise your share to 4 or 5%, you're doing quite well. And China is quitting a lot of that space. China is under threat, and wages have gone up in China. So China is quitting, is shrinking from many of these industries. India ought to be the natural one to go and take that space, but it's not doing it. It's really Bangladesh, Vietnam. These are the countries that are taking up that space.
All right, let's take 2 or 3 more questions, and then we can try and break it. Tarana.
Hi,
sorry.
thanks for the talk.
Go ahead. Then.
Oh,
I was pointing to the one person, but you had a mic in your hand, so.
you were saying that continued growth is predicated on India not rolling back the reforms that it has instituted, correct?
Yes. Well,
So-
I'm saying at least maintaining the reforms that are in place and not reversing those.
Right. So how do we go about making sure that the individuals, the citizens, and/or the government and politicians don't do that if we think it's a good thing? And I guess that question's valid for other governments too, other countries.
Yeah. No, this is a question in political economy, and no single individual can do very much. But for me, there are reasons to be optimistic, because today the voters really do demand good performance. There's one paper I had done myself actually, but a lot of others have done along very similar lines now, particularly in the states. If you look at the elections, chief ministers who don't deliver good outcomes as in growth really largely, with which other good outcomes are correlated, they get thrown out. The identity politics that used to dominate is far less today. In the rhetoric, you might see a lot of this going on, but if you look at the outcomes, chief ministers who have delivered, look at Naveen Patnaik from Orissa, is into his 4th term or 3rd term, 3 terms certainly he's completing, and maybe he's in the 4th. Nitish Kumar, who did very well, the Prime Minister himself in Gujarat for 3 terms he's served. So I think the people themselves now are demanding something very different. And we had some hypotheses, Jagdish, Bhagwati, and I wrote one small paper in the Wall Street Journal once back in 2004, that the politics, when nothing was changing, when the growth was so low, people figured, it didn't matter who was going to rule. This fatalism kind of sets in when nothing changes for a very long period of time, and so you keep returning the same government. But once the people saw that it was possible to grow at 7-8%, I think they are today much more demanding. So that's what I sort of pin my hopes on. But as individuals, how much we can do, some difference we can make, but in the end, it's convincing the politicians. My own personal view is that we economists really don't do enough there. I think we are too much into our own sandbox, and we simply don't get out of our sandboxes. But certainly, economists do have the responsibility to go out and change people's minds, and do that by informing people about what good policies can do.
Let's take one last question from Tarana.
Good afternoon. So I'm Tarana, also first year student in applied economics. Sorry, am I audible? So as you discussed that since 2014, we've seen a significantly higher GDP growth rate, and also because you've closely working with the Indian government, I thought it would be interesting to ask as to what are the 3 economic reforms or policies which you felt have been successful since 2014 in India, and 3 which you felt were poorly thought out.
And what was the last part?
And 3 that you felt were poorly thought out or poorly executed.
3 good ones and 3 bad ones.
No, poorly only, I feel only one thing that was done poorly, which is simply the trade that I mentioned, that the tariffs got raised It didn't happen while I was there, but that just happens to be that way. I don't think I could have stopped it. Perhaps I could have helped delay it, but so that really is the main one I feel that was the bad one. On the good side, I'll say first I'll say the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Act, or Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, IBC, very, very important. I've been writing for almost 15 to 20 years that India needs a state-of-the-art bankruptcy law. Finally, we have one, and finally, all the cleaning up of the NPAs, which is where I'll put another second one where simply it was delayed too long, which is the cleaning up of the NPAs. That should have been taken up in the first year. It was delayed. So you can say in that sense it was poorly done in terms of timing, but it's not being done. IBC, so I'll put that's the one big reform that got done in the government. GST, Goods and Services Tax, second. Both at par, I would say they're both very important. I'm not sure which one I should rank ahead. If you want me to take the third one, there are many candidates for the third actually. So I'll give you 4 actually, so not 3. The third I would say is the whole digitization that happened, as a part of which India has a better digital infrastructure today than most of the countries. Eventually it's going to, it's not, we are internet plus. What is the plus? You got Aadhaar, you got the bank accounts that were not, some 400 million bank accounts opened under the Jan Dhan Yojana. Then our platform for bank transfers called the UPI, it is state of the art, and Geo. So it's private and public actually participating. And this whole network has also then led to what we call the direct benefit transfer, DBT. So that sort of would be my third, the whole, all digitization, DBT and all, which really has helped plug many of these leakages that used to happen in the distribution of these social benefits. And the fourth one, which I would not, which probably I would put on the top, it's not in the nature of economic reforms, it's more in the nature of social reforms with economic implications, but I would put actually at the top is the Swachh Bharat, the toilet revolution. I think that's where, when Prime Minister announced it in the first year, on 15th of August 2014, that he would, by the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, he is going to have the whole country out of open defecation. I mean, I was thought, what has he done? This cannot be done. It's impossible. Because at that time, only 34% rural households had toilets in their homes. So, 150 years, you get to 34%. But boy, today it's close to 90%. Not every toilet is being used, but building one is the beginning. That's the first step. And I think there's been a lot of movement for behavioral change and so forth. So certainly the use is certainly on the rise. And 19 states have been bold enough to, they say that they're open defecation free in rural India. I think that's a really major thing, and also purely in terms of cleanliness. So this is one aspect of the Swachh Bharat movement, but also in cleaning up the cities and so forth. Some cities have done wonderful job. I mean, I visited, for example, Indore myself before and after, and today Indore looks much cleaner. Vizag, Visakhapatnam in Andhra Pradesh, unbelievable clean. Parts of Jaipur, my own hometown, much cleaner today. And the awareness of it is phenomenal actually. The children, younger children telling their parents, you can't throw stuff out of the car. It's phenomenal. I think, we have been a very dirty country, if you ask, whether you look at rural India or urban India, and this was much needed. So I regard that as a very, very important thing.
Great. On that note, let's end the discussion here.